Hey guys, tonight we drift toward the coast of the United Arab Emirates, but not to the glinting skyscrapers or glass malls you might expect. Instead, we're going someplace older, quieter, a place the sea built and the wind forgot. Imagine a ghost city, not of stone or steel, but of sun-bleached coral bricks, oyster shell mortar, and rooftops that crackle in the heat like firewood. You won't hear traffic here. Just the occasional echo of waves that once brought fortune, fever, and the faint sound of someone grumbling about pearl taxes in 1894. Welcome to Al Jazeera Al Hamra, the Red Island, a place where the houses are half sea, half sand, and entirely abandoned. Now, let's be honest. You probably wouldn't survive a full summer day here without a gallon of water, 3 fans, and an attitude adjustment. But that's what makes this place so quietly incredible. People did survive here, even thrived, and they left behind a city that's now suspended in time, like an old postcard from a world where the sea was the internet and oysters were gold. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is where you are. Always fun seeing sleepy viewers from every time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nestled on the Ras Al Khaimah coastline, Al Jazeera Al Hamra was once a modest but bustling port. Not flashy, just well positioned. It was home to pearlers, fishermen, and traders who, despite working in salt, blistering heat, managed to build homes as elaborate as they were practical. What made the place unusual wasn't just its economy, it was its bones. The very walls around you are made of the sea, coral stones fused with sun-dried mud, broken mollusks, barnacles, and the occasional ghost crab sealed forever in plaster. You run your fingers along one of these walls, and the texture isn't smooth. It's pitted, brittle, a little too organic. You might expect stone. Instead, it's like the building was grown underwater and just emerged. Most scholars agree the town dates back to at least the 14th century, though some buildings are newer, added in the 1800s when the Gulf's pearl trade peaked. The city was strategically located on a tidal inlet that let boats come and go with ease. That tidal rhythm dictated everything. High tide brought dhows in. Low tide revealed muddy walkways that children treated like secret escape routes. Shoes optional, accidents frequent. And in the middle of all this, mosques, watchtowers, souks, even a small fort, all made from the same chalky, crumbling ingredients. You can still see the prayer niches in the mosque walls, simple but precise, always pointing west toward Mecca with a kind of quiet certainty that concrete never quite captures. Mainstream geography tells us that settlements rise around resources, rivers, mines, farmland. Al Jazeera Al Hamra had none of those, just the sea and the sun, which, according to one theory, made its people tougher, saltier, and more deeply interwoven with the ocean than even some islanders. The water didn't just surround them, it was them. Scientists still argue about how viable coral stone really is as a building material. Some say it's thermally perfect for the desert climate, porous enough to breathe, sturdy enough to last centuries. Others say it's a miracle it hasn't all collapsed yet. Walk through the ruins now, and you'll see both points in action. Some homes still stand tall with their latticework screens intact. Others have half caved in, spilling their shell mortar guts into alleyways now thick with sand. And then there's the smell, not unpleasant but specific. A bit of salt, a bit of lime, a whiff of dried palm leaves, and always, just below that, the sour ghost of oyster shells that once paid the rent. A fun side note: in this town, goats were more than livestock. They were heat alarms. When temperatures soared, they'd bleat at specific tones, prompting housewives to douse the clay walls with water to cool the rooms down. Air conditioning, version 1.0. And if the goats were unusually quiet, that meant a storm was coming. Or possibly a British customs officer. You'll hear more about those later. For now, picture the morning routine here. Circa 1920, the soft crunch of sand underfoot, the sharp slap of palm mats being beaten clean, the metallic smell of fish scales drying on racks, children chasing crabs between doorways, men bent over pearl baskets, sorting them with a patience that bordered on religious. And every wall you pass, made of someone's hands, layered and tamped and shell-packed by neighbors who knew where the best coral beds were, knew how to pull the sea into form, literally. We'll dive deeper into how those buildings came together in a few sections. But for now, rest in this soft, coral-colored world. Let the silence settle in, like dust in a mosque's forgotten corner. Just the sea, the shells, and the slow hush of a city waiting for company. If you stand in the center of the abandoned square of Al Jazeera Al Hamra long enough, you'll start to notice how everything leans ever so slightly toward the sea. It's not just the direction of the buildings or the worn footpaths. It's a kind of gravitational pull, as though the town never stopped listening to the waves. Even now, in ruin, it orients itself toward the tides that once gave it life. Built by the sea, abandoned by time. That's the quiet truth of this place. At its height in the early 20th century, Al Jazeera Al Hamra housed somewhere between 500 and 1,000 residents, though counting was loose, and some scholars argue that number could be far higher. What we know for certain is that the town wasn't randomly scattered. It was laid out deliberately, with neighborhoods radiating outward like a sun-bleached nautilus. There were designated zones for pearl divers, for traders, for religious leaders, even a small outsider quarter for visiting merchants and the occasional lost camel trainer. The architecture follows a pattern you start to recognize the more you look. Thick walls made of coral rock, outer coatings of shell-lime plaster, narrow doorways to keep the heat out, and shaded central courtyards that double as kitchens, playpens, and makeshift gossip forums. Some houses even had wind towers, primitive air conditioning funnels designed to pull cool air down into sleeping quarters. Ingenious, really, and entirely local. When it rained, which was rare but dramatic, the whole town would glisten like it had just been dipped in sugar. The shells embedded in the plaster caught the light and sparkled, and children would run around barefoot, shouting about rain angels and sea dust. One traveler once wrote that the rain made the city look like a wedding cake melting in slow motion. The alleyways were tight enough that two donkeys couldn't pass without one backing up, which led to some truly theatrical traffic jams. But these tight corridors weren't poorly planned. They were climate-controlled pathways. The close walls created shade, and the high plaster kept the sun from bouncing off surfaces like a heat lamp. You could walk the entire town at high noon without burning your feet, if you knew the right paths. Some of the town's more curious features are the wells, many of which still exist. They were lined not with stone, but again, with coral, a material you wouldn't expect to hold water so well, and yet, these ancient aquifers managed to stay cool, even during the summer infernos. Local belief held that if you dropped a broken shell into the well and heard 3 splashes instead of 1, rain was coming. Scientists still argue whether this was just acoustics or a bizarrely accurate microbarometer. It wasn't all heat and hardship, though. At sunset, the town came alive in the quietest way possible. People gathered on rooftops to drink mint tea, watch the color bleed out of the sea, and argue about which uncle had the best pearl haul that week. Laughter carried easily on the salt air, and oil lamps were lit with a kind of reverence, the flame flickering behind shell-paneled windows that cast fish-scale patterns onto the walls. It's worth noting that there were no street names, no addresses, just landmarks. The house near the big palm, the door with the 3 shell ridges, next to the goat that bites. Navigation was oral and deeply local. Outsiders found it maddening, Locals found it charming. The city's tie to the sea wasn't just economic, it was sensory. At night, the walls would breathe with moisture. The salty air would settle on surfaces, creating a faint white crust by morning. Shells embedded in the walls would hum slightly when the wind hit just right. A low, almost musical vibration that people claimed could soothe babies to sleep, or put even the grumpiest grandfather into a nap trance. Of course, not everyone found the place idyllic. The British, upon arrival in the late 1800s, called it a most curious settlement, disordered in plan, but overly devoted to mollusk architecture, which honestly isn't the worst Yelp review for a city made of seashells. Still, they struggled to map it. The cartographers kept getting lost between duplicate buildings or confused by alleyways that doubled back on themselves like snail trails. One famously threw his compass in the sea after 3 days of mapping and declared the entire town possessed by marine geometry. But what those colonial records do reveal is just how dense the city once was. Courtyards were small but intimate, shared by families with a dozen children and at least one goat per rooftop. Walls were communal chalkboards, graffiti scratched in with oyster shells, ranging from poetic declarations of love to crude depictions of suspiciously round fish. It wasn't just residential life that flourished. There were communal ovens for baking flatbreads, meeting halls lined with woven mats, and a central market where bartering was a high art. A single pearl could fetch a camel or a year's worth of dried fish. Or, if the merchant was clever, both. In the silence of the present-day ruins, you can almost hear it. The soft slap of sandals, the hiss of hot tea poured from dented kettles, the low murmur of evening prayer as the muezzin's voice floated above coral rooftops. Today, sand fills many of those alleyways. The walls lean a little more. The goats have long since wandered off, but the bones remain, salt-stained, sea-etched, and stubbornly beautiful. And if you press your palm to one of those old plaster walls, you might feel a tiny tremble, not from tectonic movement, but from memory, from tides, from the deep, echoless hush of a city that was never supposed to last, and yet somehow still stands. Step into one of the larger homes near the heart of Al Jazeera Al Hamra, and you'll immediately notice something peculiar. Not size, not wealth, but coolness, literal coolness. Despite the desert sun beating down from above, the room temperature dips like you've just stepped into a whisper. That's no accident. The people who built this city understood heat the way a sailor understands currents, intimately, with deep respect and just a little bit of suspicion. The architecture wasn't just clever, it was necessary. In a place where shade could mean the difference between comfort and heat stroke, every wall, doorway, and ventilation shaft served a purpose. The houses were mostly 1 or 2 stories, compact, built inward toward open-air courtyards with low steps and palm-lined balconies. And yet they breathe. The trick? Shells and coral, of course, but not just slapped together like beach rubble. These materials were chosen for their structure. Coral is porous, riddled with tiny holes, which made it a natural thermal insulator. Air passed through the buildings more like water, drawn from narrow slits in outer walls and funneled upward through bargeal, those iconic wind towers. A bargeal isn't some ornate medieval chimney. It's a passive cooling system that channels breezes downward while pushing hot air out the top. They look like little square turrets and rise above the rooftops like stone periscopes. On a windy day, they could drop the indoor temperature by 10 degrees or more, without a single moving part. No fans, no fuel, just shellstone and wind. Somewhere, a modern HVAC engineer just sighed with envy. But it wasn't just about function. There's beauty here too, in the little things. Door frames carved with delicate geometric motifs, iron grates shaped like sea stars, latticework windows that filtered sunlight into latticed shadows. These weren't decorative afterthoughts. They were daily reminders that this city belonged to both sand and sea. The floors were packed mud or crushed shell, depending on how fancy you were, and they had a delightful crunch to them, like walking on stale cereal. Children played games with pebbles and oyster chips, tossing them into holes scraped into the floors like miniature bowling alleys. And if a pebble bounced unusually, it was considered a sign of good luck, of incoming rain, or of that one aunt finally getting married. Interpretations varied wildly. Interestingly, while most of the homes shared a general layout, rooms around a courtyard, a small kitchen tucked near the back, narrow staircases curling up to shaded rooftops, no two were exactly alike. Some had secret niches for family treasures. Others had hooks in the ceiling for hanging baskets of dates. A few had built-in benches molded into the walls, perfect for midday naps or passive-aggressive family meetings. One curious detail that shows up again and again: sea glass. Small shards embedded into plaster near doorways and windows. Scholars still debate the purpose. Some say it was decorative, others argue it was practical. Scattered light, glare reduction, even spirit deterrence. Whatever the reason, it worked. At certain times of day, the sunlight would hit those glass bits just right, and the house would sparkle as if it were winking at you. Speaking of sparkle, let's not forget the shell lime plaster that held it all together. Mixed from crushed shells, water, sand, and sometimes camel urine, for texture, allegedly. This plaster was the city's version of duct tape. It patched holes, sealed gaps, and coated entire structures with a finish that both shimmered and protected. Scientists still argue about the long-term durability of shell lime compounds. Some insist they deteriorate too easily when exposed to modern pollution. Others marvel that any structure could endure a century of Gulf humidity and still stand upright. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. Some of the homes in Al Jazeera Al-Hamra are barely more than crumbling outlines. Others, you could move in tomorrow with a broom and a mattress. One of the more whimsical theories floating among local historians is that certain builders embedded personalized shells into walls as signatures. A spiral here, a scallop there, a sort of "I was here" before graffiti was a thing. Whether that's true or just a poetic afterthought, we'll never know for sure. But it's a comforting idea, that a man or woman could leave their mark not with ink or stone, but with something plucked from the sea. And yes, while most of the shells used were practical, chosen for shape and adhesion, some homes boast decorative borders of pearly clam shells, set in tidy rows like buttons on a wedding tunic. Were they showing off? Absolutely, wouldn't you? But for all its charm and cleverness, the architecture wasn't indestructible. Sandstorms chipped away at facades. Salt air eroded corners. And when the last families left, more on that later, the wind moved in, slowly undressing the city of its plaster and shell skin. Yet somehow the bones remain. Take a walk at dusk and you'll see what we mean. The buildings are soft silhouettes now, outlined in moonlight. Cracked walls open into rooms filled with silence. And those old bargeal towers, they still stand, casting long rectangular shadows across the dunes like stone sundials with nowhere else to be. If you're quiet, you might hear the faint whistle of air moving through coral slats. Or maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe it's just the house, breathing. If you sat at the central crossroads of Al Jazeera Al-Hamra, 100 years ago you wouldn't hear the roar of traffic or the hum of electricity. What you'd hear is life, slow, rhythmic, and tied entirely to the sea. The shuffling of leather sandals against crushed shell roads. The clink of bronze scales as pearl merchants weighed their day's luck. And everywhere, always, the low, salty breeze rustling through palm thatch awnings, reminding everyone just how close the ocean lived. This city wasn't built for kings or empires. It was built for people, hard-working, sea-bound people whose lives orbited around three things: fishing, pearling, and trade. Let's start with the pearlers. They were the rock stars of the Gulf, if your idea of glamour includes bleeding fingers and lung-crushing dives into jellyfish-infested waters. These divers were typically young, lean, and half-mad with salt. They tied stones to their feet, gripped nose clips made from turtle shell, and plunged straight down into darkness with nothing but a rope and hope. All for a mollusk that might contain a pearl. Pearling was more than a job. It was a season, a ritual, and sometimes a family curse. Boys trained from childhood, learning to hold their breath and spot the right oysters. Girls sang songs to calm the boats on stormy days. Simple lullabies meant to ward off angry spirits or just fill the silence. Some divers came back with pearls. Some came back with jellyfish stings the size of soup bowls. Some didn't come back at all. Yet for centuries, this dangerous hustle made the Gulf rich. Al Jazeera Al-Hamra was one of the quieter ports, but it had a reputation, honest deals, decent beds, and the best salted fish in the region. Even the grumpiest traders knew that if you wanted your pearls appraised fairly, you stopped here. They'd sit in the open-air market with little tin bowls of oysters, cracking them open like sunburned sommeliers, judging each sliver of nacre with squinted eyes and muttered prayers. Fishermen, meanwhile, were the unsung rhythm section of the town. While pearlers chased fortune, fishermen kept people fed. They used hand-woven nets, coracle-style boats, and passed-down ocean lore, more detailed than most weather apps. They knew where the sardines liked to dance, when the grouper got lazy, and which stars meant go home now. One popular superstition? Never cast your net when a flamingo is flying overhead. Why? No one really knows. But a surprising number of men swore that ignoring that bird led to tangled nets and twisted ankles. Scientists still argue whether this counts as avian meteorology or mass coincidence. Either way, flamingos were treated with a strange mix of reverence and side-eye. And then there were the traders, the middlemen in sandals. They connected Al Jazeera Al-Hamra to the larger Gulf world, to Basra in the north, to Zanzibar in the south, even to India across the Arabian Sea. They brought spices, textiles, beads, and stories. So many stories. They were the town's unofficial news network, walking in with updates on distant rulers, changing taxes, and what color tunics were currently in. Trade here wasn't conducted in massive caravans or gilded ships. It was quiet, practical, and done mostly by memory. Credit was tracked in ledgers made of palm pulp paper, and contracts were often sealed with a handshake and a glance toward the mosque. It's said that if you cheated someone here, you didn't just lose a deal, you lost the right to drink from the communal well. Social exile in the desert is no joke. At the center of all this activity was the town's souk, a roofed market lane lined with stone stalls and shade-cloth canopies. It smelled of dried fish, hot spices, and whatever fruit managed to survive the trip inland. Children ran errands with baskets. Old men smoked date-leaf cigars, and women bartered with the kind of precise, polite savagery that only seasoned negotiators possess. There were no loud advertisements, no flashy signs, just people, word of mouth, and a stunning ability to remember prices from 6 months ago. What's fascinating is how entwined everything was. The fishermen sold their catch to the traders sold it salted to the divers brought in pearls that the traders sold abroad, which brought back fabrics that the fishermen's wives turned into dresses that everyone then commented on during Friday prayer. A closed loop, tidy, efficient, tied to the sea in ways that didn't just shape the economy, but shaped the people themselves. And at the center of it all, the mosque, modest but precise, with shell mortar walls, a prayer niche etched like a whispered command, and a simple, elegant minaret, not for show but for function, to carry the call to prayer over rooftops made of palm fronds and coral dust. Scientists still debate how such a small settlement maintained such a complex, self-sustaining rhythm. Some argue it was location, access to both inland caravans and the sea. Others point to the materials themselves. A city built of local substance is easier to maintain, easier to rebuild, and easier to walk away from if needed, which, as you'll learn later, they eventually did. But for now, close your eyes and imagine a midday in the Shell City. The market murmurs, the sails flap at the pier, someone's laughing, probably over a bad pearl deal, and a goat bleats in the distance, sounding suspiciously like it's mocking someone. Welcome to a city where even the livestock has opinions. Let's take a moment and talk about seashells, not the shiny pink ones you see in souvenir shops, but the gritty, chalky, sun-bleached kind. The kind you wouldn't even pick up at the beach unless you had a reason. In Al Jazeera Al Hamra, they had a reason. Quite a few, actually. In this city, seashells weren't just trash from yesterday's lunch. They were currency, they were construction material, and if the rumors are to be believed, they were sometimes used in burials to decorate the dead. This was a place where mollusks mattered more than marble, and clam fragments might just get you a new robe. Let's start with the economics of it. Before the Gulf region developed a solid coin economy, bartering and shell-based trade were common, especially among smaller coastal communities. Tiny cowries, those smooth little shells with slits down the center, were sometimes exchanged like coins, particularly in trades involving cloth, perfume, or firewood. They weren't minted by any state, but everyone knew what they were worth, kind of like sea-sourced IOUs. Drop a cowrie on the market counter and you might get a basket of dates. Drop 3 and you might just get a nod of respect from the baker. Maybe. Some archaeologists believe certain households even kept shell caches, tucked into jars or pouches like loose change. Hidden behind wall niches or beneath floorboards, these tiny banks were a safeguard against bad fishing days or last-minute gift obligations. Scientists still argue over whether the cowries found in the ruins were part of a formal economy or just decorative. Some say they were sewn into clothes or used to mark dowries. Others insist that in a town built of shells, assuming any shell was just for fun is a risky bet. Then there's the matter of taxes. According to local oral histories, certain tributes could be paid in pearls, shell-lime bricks, or bundles of dried fish packed in woven seagrass. And if your harvest was especially poor, you could settle up using baskets lined with large clam shells, each one cleaned and stacked like ceramic bowls. Were these used for cooking? Possibly. For taxes? Probably. For both? Highly likely, knowing how creatively people stretch resources in places where the next supply boat might arrive. Eventually. As for construction, well, by now you already know that most of the city was built from coral rock and shell-lime plaster. But the role of actual seashells in that process deserves some slow appreciation. You see, the lime used in plaster isn't mined from quarries in this part of the world. It's made, very patiently, by burning crushed oyster and clam shells in open pits until they powder into quicklime. That powder is then mixed with water and sand and sometimes camel hair. Yes, camel hair for flexibility. The result? A durable, lightweight paste that sets hard and stays cool. Shells were the skeleton of every wall. They were in the bones of the place, literally. A walk through the city today reveals tiny fragments of those shells still embedded in walls. Some are large enough to trace the ridges with your finger. Others shimmer faintly in the right light, creating a pearlescent glow beneath layers of sand and dust. One historian called them the original insulation with a side of sparkle. Not wrong. Then there's the funerary angle, perhaps the most mysterious. Locals speak of old graves, now lost to the dunes, where shells were arranged in patterned arcs over the burial mounds. Whether for spiritual protection or just decoration, no one agrees, but the stories linger. Some say the dead were given the best shells from the family pile, sometimes engraved with names or simple blessings. Others say seashells were left to keep the soul company, like little messengers to the afterlife, whispering tales of the sea. That part of the history is harder to prove. Time, sandstorms, and human disinterest have erased many of the old cemeteries. But once in a while, after a strong desert wind, locals still find shells with scratch marks that look suspiciously intentional, spirals, dots, even the faint outline of a fish. It's hard not to wonder. And shells weren't just practical, they were status symbols too. Some of the wealthier homes in Al Jazeera Al Hamra used large, glossy shells as insets above doorways or window frames, like medieval bling. One notable doorway features a cluster of fan-shaped scallop shells arranged in a starburst, with a faint tint of pink that somehow survived the decades. Walk through that door and you know, these people had opinions about interior design. In weddings, shells were common gifts. Brides were often given stringed necklaces of mother-of-pearl or cowrie belts to wear over embroidered robes, and it wasn't uncommon to gift a mirror framed in shell fragments, polished just enough to reflect moonlight on special occasions. Modest but magical. One particularly charming local tradition: shell whispering. Children would collect conch-like shells, press them to their ears, and tell one another what they heard. It was always something vague, a fish giggling, or Uncle Hassan snoring underwater. But for a town where storytelling was half the economy, it was a vital early skill. The sound wasn't just imagination, of course. Scientists explain it as ambient noise being amplified in the curved chamber of the shell. Still, when a 4-year-old swears she heard a crab give directions to a lost dhow, you don't argue. You take notes. This deeply embedded shell culture created a strange but beautiful kind of continuity. Everything in the town looped back to the sea, not just physically but culturally. You walked on shells, ate from them, built with them, traded them, and sometimes mourned with them. Even the town's name, Al Jazeera Al Hamra, the Red Island, was once surrounded by waters so full of shellfish you could gather dinner with your ankles. The tides have long since receded, but the memory sticks. In the walls, in the stories, in the quiet crackle of wind that sounds, if you're half asleep, like waves on a shallow shore. And if you dream here, really let yourself drift, you might just imagine a city breathing slowly through its shell-laced skin, waiting for someone to remember. The sun in Al Jazeera Al Hamra is not gentle. It doesn't peek over the horizon with warmth and poetry, it erupts. By mid-morning, every rooftop is blazing, every wall throws off heat like a bakery oven, and even the goats consider their life choices. But as intense as the desert sun is, the people here developed a rhythm around it, a choreography of shade, breeze, and patience, a kind of sleepy, sunlit wisdom. Their lives moved according to the heat, when to wake, when to sleep, when to bargain, when to disappear into cool corners and wait the sun out, like it was a guest who overstayed its welcome. Mornings were quiet but productive. Before the temperature reached lizard-on-a-skillet levels, people swept courtyards, rinsed fish, patched sails, and fetched water from the coral-lined wells. The light was soft, a little golden, and the alleys echoed with a kind of communal muttering, half greetings, half complaints about the weather, and at least one daily dispute over who stole whose drying sardines. By noon, activity slowed. Shops closed their shutters. The markets quieted. Children were called indoors not for discipline, but for survival. And homes, those brilliant little inventions of coral and shell, transformed into shaded sanctuaries. Families gathered in the coolest rooms, often sitting on woven mats, fanning themselves with palm leaves, sipping mint water, and telling stories that no one was really listening to because they were all half asleep anyway. This was the city's unofficial siesta, unspoken but strictly followed. It wasn't laziness, it was adaptation. There's no prize for fainting in a heat wave. And here's the quirky bit. Some residents believe that if you stayed too still during this midday pause, scorpions might mistake you for a rock and take shelter beneath you. Whether that ever actually happened is up for debate. Scientists still argue whether these tales were based on incidents or just clever ways to keep kids from napping face down on the floor. As the afternoon crept along, the breeze would shift. A soft wind, often from the sea, would start to roll in, and with it, the town woke back up. Women returned to communal ovens to bake flatbreads, their laughter mixing with the snap of palm leaves in the breeze. The fishermen came back with their catches, hauling baskets of silver-scaled fish glistening like spilled coins. And the rooftops, once too hot to touch, became prime real estate. Evenings were the town's golden hour, literally and figuratively. The sky turned apricot and lavender. The calls to prayer drifted from the minaret, soft and slow. People climbed up onto flat rooftops, spread out cushions, and let the sea wind cool their bones. Meals were shared up there. Simple things like dates, fish stew, and sweet rice, eaten with fingers and passed between neighbors. It wasn't just dining, it was re-entry. A gentle return to the world after the sun's tyranny. Rooftop life had its own rules. Children had to be careful not to leap from roof to roof, though many tried. Privacy was respected through strategic mat placement, and everyone knew not to stare too long at someone else's supper unless invited. One poor teenager once got caught peeking over a wall at a neighbor's goat curry and was publicly assigned fish cleaning duty for a week. A harsh but fair sentence. Nighttime in Al Jazeera. Al-Hamra was its own kind of performance. The stars came out, bright, sharp, and close. With no city lights to dull them, constellations practically glowed. The older folks could name every one of them, too. The fisherman's hook, the pearl diver's path, the goat who ran from the moon. None of these were in any astronomy textbook, but they were remembered just as clearly. Some nights wind would thread through the bargeal towers, whistling soft songs that played over the rooftops like a lullaby. It made the whole city sound like it was gently exhaling. The sounds of daily life, clanging pots, the creak of doors, distant singing, grew quiet. And slowly, without ceremony, the town went to sleep. Except for the cats, of course. The cats of Al Jazeera Al-Hamra were night shift royalty, darting between shadows, yowling at one another in long feline debates that no human ever fully understood. Some locals believed these cats were the reincarnations of stubborn traitors, still haggling long after death. One thing you might not expect in such a sun-scorched place: blankets. But yes, they used them. Light, woven ones, scented with jasmine or rose water, pulled over feet during cooler desert nights. The wind could turn sharp after midnight, and waking up barefoot on a rooftop with sand in your hair was considered poor planning. This daily rhythm, sunrise bustle, midday stillness, sunset gatherings, midnight whispers, gave the town its pulse. Even now, walking through the ruins at different times of day, you can feel the echoes of that rhythm. The warm stones of morning, the quiet, breathless hush of noon, the playful gusts of twilight, the cooled, crumbly hush of midnight. Geographers will tell you that desert living requires adaptation, but what they sometimes forget is that it also creates poetry, in the patterns of daily life, in the way shadows stretch across coral walls, in the quiet decisions made not out of laziness but out of ancient wisdom. You don't fight the sun, you outwait it. And maybe that's what the town teaches us most. That survival isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just knowing when to pause, when to breathe, when to let the heat pass and the cool wind find you again. Imagine trying to build a city without bricks, cement, or steel. No hardware stores, no forklifts, just your hands, the sea, and whatever your goat hasn't eaten yet. That's the challenge Al Jazeera Al-Hamra's early builders faced, and somehow they pulled it off. What stands today, crumbling but still proud, was born not from grand blueprints or royal mandates, but from shell piles, sun-scorched sweat, and an almost comedic level of persistence. This was DIY urban planning, Desert Edition. Let's walk through the process, step by salty, ridiculous step, of how to build a wall from the sea. Step 1. Find coral. Not the vibrant, colorful reef kind. We're talking dead coral, dense, pale, and rough like a pumice brick. Builders harvested it in slabs from nearby shallow waters, using rudimentary saws, chisels, and a lot of swearing. These coral blocks weren't uniform, which meant every wall was a puzzle. And like all good puzzles, some pieces didn't quite fit. That's where Seashells came in, used to fill gaps, buffer corners, and sometimes add a touch of style if you happen to like scallop flare. Step 2. Burn some shells. Remember that gorgeous shimmering beach you just walked past? Time to set it on fire. The process of making lime plaster from seashells involved collecting hundreds, sometimes thousands of them, drying them, and then slowly burning them in open kilns until they crumbled into a brittle, chalky substance. Add a bit of water, maybe some sand, and possibly a dash of camel dung, still debated, and you've got mortar. Scientists still argue whether the local kilns got hot enough to properly calcine shell into lime, but clearly something worked. The walls are still standing. Step 3. Carry it all back. No carts, no donkeys, just a line of people walking coral blocks and baskets of shell lime through the narrow alleys like very determined ants. Some used makeshift sleds or drag lines. Some wore padded cloth on their heads and balanced the bricks like they were smuggling furniture out of a wedding. And then came the real challenge, stacking it all so it wouldn't fall over during the next sandstorm. Coral, while light and insulative, is also brittle. You couldn't just pile it up like Legos. You had to lay it carefully with thick mortar to cradle each block. The shell lime would seep into the porous stone and harden over time, forming a surprisingly sturdy structure. Not earthquake-proof, but perfectly suitable for the occasional goat stampede. One especially clever technique. Builders left intentional holes between coral blocks, small gaps to allow hot air to escape and cooler sea breezes to flow through. Think of it as medieval Gulf air conditioning. From a distance, the walls looked solid. Up close, they were a matrix of breathability and strategy. Roofs, meanwhile, were feats of low-budget engineering. They used palm trunks as beams, layered with palm fronds, and then covered with more mud and, of course, crushed shells. During heavy rain, which came maybe twice a year if they were lucky, the rooftops would hiss and steam like angry teapots. But most of the time, they did the job. Lightweight, quick to repair, and biodegradable if things got really bad. Of course, no medieval town was complete without its ongoing maintenance drama. Walls cracked, plaster peeled, roofs sagged. And since everyone built their homes themselves, or at least with help from their cousins, repairs were constant and communal. You'd often see someone casually patching a corner of a mosque on their way to the market. Just brushing up the Chibla wall, be right back with fish. Children were often sent to collect repair shells. That's right, not firewood, not water, shells. The more intact, the better. A good fragment was currency. A perfect spiral could earn you a bowl of dates and a break from chores. One local tale tells of a boy who brought home a shell so beautiful, his father added it to the house's main doorway. It's still there today, barely hanging on, but undeniably fabulous. Some structures in the town even use shells for decoration in ways that seem almost too delicate for the environment. Window frames inlaid with clams, courtyard fountains, now dry, that once had shell mosaics. Even inscriptions carved into coral, names, prayers, or in one case, what appears to be a very flattering poem about someone's goat. Scientists visiting the ruins today remain baffled by just how well some of these constructions held up. Too fragile to last, is what some textbooks claim, and yet here they are. Yes, battered. Yes, slowly crumbling, but still standing. Still tracing the outline of a life lived entirely in concert with wind, salt, and shell. But maybe the most charming detail of all? The way construction sounds carried in this town. When someone hammered coral or mixed plaster, the echoes bounced oddly between the walls. The shell-laced structures reflected sound in unpredictable ways. Conversations from one courtyard could sometimes be heard in another, several houses down. This led to a lot of accidental eavesdropping and a handful of very confusing arguments. "Who told you that?" "You did." "No, I didn't." "You whispered it through the wall." One British officer stationed here in the 1930s reportedly wrote, "This town breathes and listens more than it speaks." And honestly, he might have been onto something. So next time you see a discarded shell at the beach, remember, it might once have been part of someone's living room wall, or someone's ceiling, or the very step they tripped on every morning for 30 years. In Al Jazeera Al Hamra, shells weren't trash. They were structure, shelter, sound, memory. They were the stuff of home. Night falls soft in Al Jazeera Al Hamra, and with it comes the other side of the city's personality. The strange, shimmering half made of stories, myths, and salt-soaked superstition. It's when the wind starts to whisper along the coral walls and the shadows stretch just a little too long that the town's quieter truths rise to the surface. You see, in a place built almost entirely from the sea, it's no surprise that the people living here imagined the ocean as more than just water. It was a living thing, sometimes a friend, sometimes a trickster, always something to be negotiated with, gently. Let's start with oysters. To an outsider, they're just weird, slimy shellfish. But in Al Jazeera Al Hamra, oysters had personalities, not just economic value, but real moods. Fishermen swore some oysters hid their pearls on purpose, while others offered them up freely. If a diver came up with an empty shell 3 times in a row, the crew might stop to recite a short chant to unconfuse the oysters. Was it science? No. Was it strangely effective? Also no. But it made people feel better. And in a world without sonar or pearl-finding apps, that's what counted. Then there were the stories about glowing fish, tiny, flickering flashes in the water at night. Bioluminescence, say the scientists. Magic, said literally everyone else. Kids believed these fish were the spirits of lost divers returning home. Adults said if you saw one flicker near your boat, it meant good luck, unless it blinked twice, in which case you should immediately cancel your trip, stay in bed, and possibly apologize to your mother-in-law for no reason. Even wells weren't safe from storytelling. Some were believed to be talking wells, sources of strange sounds when the wind hit just right. Locals believed they echoed not just voices, but intentions. Drop a bucket while feeling angry, and the water might taste sour. Come with gratitude, and it would be sweet. Scientists still argue about the mineral content shifts in the wells, especially during seasonal tides, but no one's quite explained the phenomenon of the laughing well in the western quarter. On very still nights, people swore they could hear a chuckle deep within it. Some say it was just wind in a curved chamber. Others say the well knew something you didn't. And then there was the rule, never whistle near a well. Not because it was disrespectful, but because, according to grandmothers and goat herders alike, whistling attracted attention. From what? Well, nobody could say exactly. But the phrase, better not risk it, came up a lot. Homes were filled with small charms to ward off these invisible forces. A shark tooth embedded over a door frame, a dried seahorse hidden in a window niche, a strip of cloth soaked in date juice, wrapped around a seashell and placed behind the cooking pots. Each one had a story, a purpose, and at least one suspicious uncle who insisted it definitely worked. Whether they were meant to repel spirits, protect pearl halls, or just keep nosy neighbors away is unclear, but you'll still find remnants of these charms embedded in the ruins today. And it wasn't just sea creatures or wells that got mystical treatment. The wind itself was suspect, particularly the blue wind, a phrase used to describe the chill gusts that sometimes swept in from the sea at midnight. Locals said it could sneak into your home and whisper away your dreams. children were told to sleep under light cloths to avoid being stolen by the blue. Adults mostly rolled their eyes until they had a string of restless nights, at which point everyone blamed the wind and burned a pinch of frankincense just to be safe. Scientists, of course, have chimed in. They suggest these stories emerged from the town's extreme proximity to the sea and the unique soundscape created by coral and shell walls. The buildings amplified ordinary breezes, warped echo patterns, and made every nighttime creak or clatter feel alive. Some researchers have even modeled the acoustics of Al Jazeera Al Hamra, revealing how low-frequency sounds travel unusually well here, especially during still, humid nights. But no model can explain the feeling of standing in a moonlit alley, hearing footsteps behind you, turning, and finding only a goat. Which brings us, reluctantly, to the goat stories. Yes, there are many. No, they're not entirely flattering. One tale insists that a particular black goat could speak, only in riddles, and only to fishermen who'd lost their nets 3 times in a row. Another suggests a white goat once walked into the mosque during prayer and was promptly blessed, after which it started leading stray cats home every evening at sunset. This, according to several elders, went on for months. Were these goats special? Maybe. Were the people telling the stories sleep-deprived and possibly sun-stroked? Almost certainly. But that's the charm of a place like this, where every animal, every whisper of wind, every ripple in the water becomes a kind of message if you're quiet enough to hear it. Al Jazeera Al Hamra was a practical town. It had its markets, its boats, its daily routines, but just beneath that sandy surface lay a world thick with symbolism, with traditions passed down not in books, but in bedtime warnings and breakfast jokes. You didn't study superstition here, you just lived it. The way you might swat flies or stretch in the morning, it was part of you. And perhaps that's what makes the ruins still feel so alive. The walls aren't just walls, they're story holders. They remember things, little fishy things, windy things, things that science squints at, and folklore embraces like an old friend. So next time the wind shifts suddenly while you're walking alone, don't panic. Maybe it's just the blue wind saying hello. Al Jazeera Al Hamra didn't disappear all at once. It wasn't swallowed by a tsunami, or flattened by invaders, or scorched by fire. No, its end came the way sleep does. Gradually, gently, in long sighs and soft silences. The kind of fading that sneaks up on you, like a forgotten pot left simmering on the stove. But first came the shrinking. Over decades, the sea that once embraced the town started to pull away. Tides changed. The creek that had curled protectively around the island silted up, slowly becoming a stagnant inlet. Trade routes shifted inland. The pearl industry, once the town's lifeblood, began to collapse under the weight of cultured pearls from Japan and the unpredictable economic tides of global politics. And so, as the sea retreated, so did the reason for being here. The boats stopped arriving, the fish weren't as abundant, the markets became quieter, the children grew up and left. Families moved in 2s and 3s, often without much ceremony. One day you had a neighbor roasting fish next door. The next, the house was dark, its rooftop cushions rolled up, and its shell charm quietly missing from above the door. Of course, there were attempts to hold on. Some residents tried to pivot to new livelihoods, trading inland, raising more livestock, patching up the old homes again and again. But holding onto a town built from the sea is hard when the sea itself is walking away. Sandstorms didn't help. Each one peeled away another layer of plaster. Roofs caved in under the weight of time and disinterest. Wind slithered into the wind towers and, finding no humans to entertain, made music for the geckos and the dust. And the silence? It grew. At first it was gentle, a missing voice here, a quiet alley there. Then it became unmistakable, an echo where there used to be laughter, the creak of a shutter that no one was left to latch. Scientists and urban historians point to broader patterns. They talk about oil, about urban consolidation, about modernization. It's all true. But if you ask the remaining elders from the families who once lived here, they'll tell you something simpler. The sea stopped feeding us, so we left. Not out of bitterness, not even sadness, just necessity. The town was born of the ocean's generosity. When that generosity dried up, so did the town. A few buildings tried to resist. The fort, with its stumpy towers and coral blocks stacked like tired playing cards, held out longer than the most. Its walls still stand in places, stubborn and jagged, with small palm beams jutting out like broken ribs. The mosque's prayer niche remains perfectly intact. Quiet little crescent, carved into a wall that once faced hundreds of worshippers, but now faces only the wind. And even as nature began reclaiming the space, it did so slowly, like it wasn't quite sure if it was allowed. Sand didn't rush in like a wave. It crept, ankle by ankle, into doorways and courtyards. Thorny shrubs took root in cracks. Lizards took over the walls, and the occasional owl hooted from a hollowed wind tower, sounding for all the world like it was calling roll in a very empty school. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some of the goats stayed, long after the people left. They roamed the ruins like they owned the place, trotting down alleys like real estate agents checking for structural damage. One was even spotted perched inside a window frame, chewing on a curtain that had been hanging there since the 1960s. Whether they belonged to anyone or were just ghost goats is unclear. But they were there, living monuments to a life that was still echoing through the shells. Interestingly, the slow decay gave way to beauty. As plaster fell away, the shell and coral underlayers revealed their true colors: muted pinks, soft grays, the occasional golden shimmer when sunlight struck just right. Some visitors now describe the city as a desert reef. It's not inaccurate. The town does look like something that once lived underwater and somehow ended up here, fossilized in mid-exhale. And that echo of water, it's still there. If you walk through the southern end of the ruins after a rare rain, you'll hear it. The drip of water from broken gutters, the squelch of mud underfoot, the clink of droplets hitting leftover shell piles. For a few hours, the town remembers itself. Scientists studying the site have found evidence of gradual migration: abandoned belongings, fading charcoal drawings on interior walls, bits of cloth, empty water jars, and once, a child's sandal wedged into a niche like a final goodbye. There are no mass graves, no violent ends, just small signs of lives once lived and then lived elsewhere. The final families are believed to have left in the 1960s, many of them relocating to nearby towns that promised electricity, education, and less dust. Some oral histories mention one last gathering, an evening prayer shared under the stars, followed by tea and the quiet packing of essentials. No drama, just dusk and departure. After that, the town exhaled and stayed exhaled. Today, the footprints remain, literally. In some courtyards, you can still see the shallow impressions of where mats once rested. In others, tiny depressions show where children played games with pebbles. In one alley, someone appears to have dropped a ceramic bowl that never broke, just settled into the sand like it was done trying. So no, this city didn't fall, it faded, like a sand drawing erased not by a wave, but by the slow kiss of wind and time. And if you stand still long enough in the center of it all, you'll hear it. Not a roar, not a cry, but the gentle hush of something that knows it was once alive and is still being remembered. Sound behaves strangely in a place made of coral and shells. That's one of the first things visitors notice in Al Jazeera Al-Hamra, how even the faintest noise seems to bounce, curl, and double back on itself. Footsteps arrive half a second late. Whispers carry farther than they should. And if the breeze slips through the wind towers just right, the entire town hums like a seashell pressed to your ear. This is not a city of loud sounds. No horse-drawn clatter, no factory clang, no shouting. It's always been a soft-spoken place, and maybe that's why its acoustics matter so much. Because when a town speaks only in murmurs, the way those murmurs move becomes part of the story. Take, for example, the wind towers. These square, open-top structures were built to funnel air down into homes. But they did something else too. They turned wind into music. As air pushed through their angled slats, it created soft whistling tones that varied depending on the wind's speed, direction, and the shape of the tower's opening. Some towers gave off a high, breathy tone. Others moaned like a distant flute. If you had several houses in a row, they could sound like a slow, drifting chorus, a desert pipe organ tuned by sand. Residents used these sounds as cues. One type of whistle meant the sea breeze had returned. It was safe to go fishing. Another tone meant a storm was brewing. Children were taught to listen to the house, the way others might listen to birds or watch the sky. It was a kind of folk meteorology, delivered by architecture. Scientists still debate whether this acoustic phenomenon was deliberate or happy accident. Were the towers built with musicality in mind? Or did the builders just stumble into it while chasing airflow? Whatever the case, the result was enchanting and deeply functional. Sound wasn't just noise, it was guidance. The same was true of the town's layout. The narrow alleyways and thick walls didn't just provide shade. They also funneled and filtered sound. You could stand in one spot and hear a market 3 alleys away. Or, more mischievously, you could whisper gossip in one corner and have it, accidentally, arrive in the ear of the intended party without ever delivering it yourself. One woman once joked that you couldn't keep a secret in Al Jazeera Alhambra because even the walls eavesdrop. Another likened the town to a seashell, beautiful, curved, and always full of voices. And then there were the daily rhythms, the soundscape of life, as modern historians now call it. Morning began with a mix of human and animal music. Goats bleating, roosters testing their range, the slap of water drawn from wells. You'd hear the soft brushing of courtyards being swept, an oddly soothing, rasping sound that echoed across the rooftops like a sleepy sigh. Add in the murmur of prayer, the creak of wooden shutters, and the distant clinking of pans, and you had a kind of accidental orchestra. Midday brought stillness. Heat dampened sound, and during the town's quiet hours, everything felt muffled. Voices dropped to whispers, movement slowed, even the goats took a nap. In this hush, the occasional creak of a roof beam or distant laugh became magnified, like sound was stretching its legs in the silence. Then, as evening arrived, the city came alive again. Pots clanged, children yelled half-hearted apologies while fleeing imaginary crimes, and the rooftops buzzed with conversation, but always at a low volume. Even laughter felt wrapped in cloth. The shell and coral buildings absorbed and softened everything, creating a kind of sonic cushion. But the most magical sounds came after dark. Some nights the wind would pick up and turn the entire town into a whispering maze. Air would rush through broken doors, swirl in half-collapsed rooms, and push against lattice windows like a finger tapping to be let in. And if you were lucky, or unlucky, you might hear your name, or what sounded like your name, echoing down an alley with no one at the other end. One researcher, visiting the ruins in the early 2000s, reported hearing what he described as an intelligible murmur of voices, like a market from 50 years ago still lingering in the plaster. He chalked it up to wind and a tired brain, but he also slept with the light on that night. Another fun, fringe theory: some believe the combination of porous coral, shell lime plaster, and enclosed architecture created a natural kind of echo chamber. That, over time, these materials absorbed sound, like wax records collecting vibration, and just maybe, on the right night, they let a bit of it back out, like the city was playing back its own memories. Most scientists roll their eyes at this, but not all of them, and even the skeptics agree. There's something different about how sound moves here. It doesn't just carry, it lingers. It curls around corners. It waits. One particular spot, near the remains of a collapsed wind tower, is known locally as the echo eye. If you speak while standing there, your voice bounces back to you, but slightly changed. Some say deeper, others say slower. A few have claimed it repeats something you didn't say. It's almost certainly a trick of architecture and wind, but still, it makes you think. Maybe it's just science, or maybe it's something quieter, something older, a city that never quite stopped speaking. So if you ever walk through the ruins alone, don't be surprised if you catch yourself whispering. Everyone does. The place invites it. Not just because of superstition, but because in Al Jazeera Alhambra, even silence has an audience. If you're picturing a neat British colonial map of Al Jazeera Alhambra, complete with tidy labels and straight lines, go ahead and crumple that image right up, then set it on fire. Because when the British came to this little coral-built town, they didn't quite know what to make of it, and the feeling was mutual. To the British surveyors and agents stationed in the Persian Gulf in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Al Jazeera Alhambra was what one might diplomatically call confusing. They had names for major ports, rough coordinates for tribal territories, and folders full of treaties. But this one, a shell city that moved with the tides, looked different depending on the season and seemed to ignore cartographic logic altogether. It wasn't so easy to file away. Several reports from British colonial officers described the town as transient in nature, which was a polite way of saying we can't figure out where the shoreline ends or the town begins. You see, Al Jazeera Alhambra had a way of shifting, at least visually. Depending on the tide, the water would sneak back in around the edges, cutting off part of the settlement like an island. And when the waters receded, the surrounding mudflats gave it the appearance of a ship run aground. Add in the reflective glare from the shell-lime walls, and the entire town seemed to shimmer or blur at a distance. To British eyes trained on orderly empire building and Gothic stone forts, this made the place feel unreliable. One lieutenant wrote in a 1915 letter, "The town, while modest in population, appears to be constructed entirely from chalk, sand, and brine, and remains rather unwilling to sit still for surveying purposes." You almost have to admire the honesty. The confusion didn't stop at mapping. Diplomats attempting to categorize the town's leadership struggled with its fluid tribal structures. Al Jazeera Alhambra was largely inhabited by members of the Zab tribe, a community that didn't fit neatly into the colonial model of sultans and sheikhs, signing papers over tea. The Zab were independent, seafaring, and deeply practical. Their leaders operated more like consensus builders than monarchs. Power wasn't held, it was borrowed, and only as long as it worked. This baffled the British. Where was the hierarchy, the paperwork, the hereditary title that could be underlined in a memo? Worse yet, the town didn't offer any of the empire's favorite distractions. No massive fortifications, no oil yet, not even much in the way of dramatic rebellion, just a sleepy, resilient community that fished, dived, patched their coral houses, and politely ignored outsiders, except when they didn't. There were moments, brief, dryly humorous moments, when the town engaged directly with its visitors. One often told tale involves a British officer asking for the town's population. The elder he questioned reportedly squinted at the sun, considered his goat, and said, "More than yesterday, fewer than next week, unless my cousin visits." To be fair, the officer wrote down exactly that number. Bureaucratic precision meet Bedouin logic. The pearl trade, however, did bring some common ground. British officials, particularly those stationed in nearby Sharjah and Dubai, were increasingly interested in Gulf pearls, not just for their value, but for their economic importance to the region. And Al Jazeera Alhambra had a reputation. The pearls brought in by its divers were small but unusually lustrous, and its markets were known for relatively honest dealing, rare enough in any century. This led to occasional British attempts to formalize relations with the town. Little visits, gifts, the odd treaty draft. But the residents mostly shrugged it off. As one Zab elder reportedly told a trader, "We have enough signatures from the sea." Still, colonial cartographers persisted. They drew sketches of the streets, though no two versions ever matched. One map from 1922 shows the mosque in 3 different places. Another has a note in the margin, possibly a fort here, or a goat pen. Scientists and historians still argue about how much the British ever understood the place. Some say they intentionally kept their distance, recognizing its limited strategic value. Others suggest they underestimated it entirely, focusing on flashier ports while overlooking the cultural and architectural uniqueness Al Jazeera Al Hamra offered. But one thing is clear: the town stayed stubbornly itself. It never expanded dramatically, never modernized in a way that made it easier to absorb. It remained coral-walled, shell-bound, and temperamentally tidal. Even today, if you compare the old British maps to satellite images, you'll find gaps, overlaps, phantom buildings that either never existed or were so convincingly temporary that they fooled even the Empire. It's almost as if the town was gently resisting being understood, and maybe it was. After all, what's the point of mapping a place that was never meant to be permanent? Al Jazeera Al Hamra didn't aim to conquer or impress. It aimed to endure, quietly, humbly, and slightly out of focus. There's a kind of wisdom in that, a refusal to be fully defined, a commitment to the in-between, not land or sea, not empire or escape, just itself. So next time you see a wobbly old map with too many question marks, remember, sometimes the most interesting places are the ones that refuse to hold still. By now you might be wondering, in a town made of coral, wind, and slowly vanishing memories, was it haunted? Oh, absolutely. At least according to just about everyone who ever lived there, visited, or even briefly napped within its crumbling walls. Al Jazeera Al Hamra's ghost stories are soft-spoken, like everything else about the town. No vengeful spirits throwing furniture, no dramatic curses etched into doorways, just murmurs, shivers, footsteps in places no one walks anymore, and tales passed down with a wink and a shrug like, maybe it's true, maybe it's just the wind. One of the most enduring legends tells of the barefoot scribe. He lived in a tiny house near the western well, now half collapsed, overtaken by thorny weeds. Back then, though, he was known for wandering the alleyways with ink-stained fingers and no shoes, always muttering verses to himself. He wrote letters for the illiterate, prayers for the anxious, and love poems for the hopelessly awkward. He never married, never traveled, and, if you believe the stories, never left. After the town emptied out in the 1960s, some visitors claimed to see footprints in the dust leading toward his ruined house. Barefoot prints, fresh, still warm. Others reported scraps of palm paper tucked into window frames, short verses in elegant script, almost always ending with the same line, "I am where the shells still listen." Scientists, of course, blame this on wind, animals, or pranksters. Local kids, probably. Though how the ink managed to stay so legible in the Gulf humidity is a mystery still up for debate. But it's not just the poet. There's the courtyard with the creaking swing, long since rusted through, but still groaning at midnight, even when there's no wind. There's the tale of the whispering door, an old wooden slab at the back of what used to be a merchant's home. Every time someone tries to remove it, the hinges seize up, and a voice, faint but distinct, is said to say, "Not yet." Even the goats got involved. One house, known locally as the Donkey Watch, was said to have once held a particularly intelligent donkey that refused to be stabled anywhere else. Years after the family left, nearby herders claimed to see a shadowy shape standing in the doorway around dusk, too tall for a goat, too solid for a trick of the eye, always facing the sea. In fact, many of Al Jazeera Al-Hamra's ghost stories are sea-facing, figures glimpsed on rooftops, standing perfectly still at sunrise, shapes leaning against wind towers. People swore the spirits weren't angry, they were waiting. For what, no one could say. Perhaps a tide that never came back. Some of the most unsettling stories involve sound. Remember how we talked about the town's strange acoustics? They don't always behave. Several travelers have claimed to hear old conversations echoing down the alleyways, snippets of haggling, laughter, the clang of market pots. A few said they heard their own voices repeated back to them, altered, as if someone, or something, was rehearsing their sentences in a slightly different cadence. One French filmmaker, scouting the location in the 1980s, recorded hours of ambient sound for a documentary. When he played the tapes back later, buried beneath the static was a soft voice reciting numbers in Arabic. Not prayer, not song, just counting. He didn't remember hearing it at the time. He never used the footage. The mosque, perhaps surprisingly, is not the focus of many ghost stories. Instead, it's remembered as a place of comfort, even post-abandonment. Locals say that even now, if you enter respectfully, barefoot with a quiet heart, you'll feel a coolness that goes beyond temperature, a kind of hush, a pause in the world. But not every tale is eerie. Some are just odd. One alley is known as the Laughing Street. People walking alone there have reported spontaneous laughter bubbling up in their chest. No joke, no trigger, just a strange, ticklish joy. One woman claimed she walked the length of it giggling like a child, then exited, sat down, and promptly burst into tears. It felt like the town was remembering something funny and made me feel it too. Was she dehydrated, sunstroked? Maybe. But the story stuck. Another legend involves a parrot that never left. Kept by a spice merchant who loved to talk politics, the bird learned dozens of phrases, many of them sarcastic. After the town emptied, some say the parrot stayed behind, flying from rooftop to rooftop, mimicking trade arguments and whistling off-key prayers. A few claim they heard it as recently as the early 2000s. Not fair, it would squawk. Give me my spices. A town's memory on wings. And yes, the scientists are skeptical, as they often are. They chalk it up to suggestibility, to ruins playing tricks on the senses, the echo chamber effect, sleep deprivation, overactive imaginations. But maybe those explanations miss the point. Ghost stories aren't always about belief. Sometimes they're how a place continues to breathe, to speak, to laugh softly in the wind, or scold you through a creaky floorboard, or remind you that someone once stood right where you are, barefoot, ink-stained, wondering about the future. In Al Jazeera Al-Hamra, ghosts don't chase you. They don't rattle chains. They whisper, they write, they wait. And if you ever visit, walk slowly, speak softly, and leave a shell on a windowsill just in case someone's still listening. There are few things more quietly unsettling than a town that simply leaves. No war, no catastrophe, just one last call to prayer, one last pot of fish stew, and then footsteps fading into sand. Al Jazeera Al-Hamra's final days weren't marked by tragedy, but by something stranger. Stillness, a collective exhale, the end of a life cycle that no one formally announced, but everyone seemed to understand. The year was 1968, or maybe a few years before, depending on who you ask. Some say the departure began in the late 1950s. Others swear it was done and dusted by the early 70s. Oral histories in the region tend to stretch and fold like sand dunes, reshaped by memory, pride, and the occasional goat-related distraction. But what we do know is this. The Zab tribe, the people who had lived in Al Jazeera Al-Hamra for generations, chose to go, not in a panic, not overnight, but over time, packing up homes, closing shutters, and heading a few kilometers inland to what is now modern Ras Al Khaimah. Why did they leave? Ask a historian and they'll talk about politics, disputes over land rights, promises made and unmade during the formation of the United Arab Emirates, tensions between the local tribes and the ruling families, the rise of oil economies and the shifting weight of power. Ask a former resident, and the answer might be simpler. There was nothing left. The sea changed, the jobs moved, our children needed schools. Life had outgrown the shells. The last families to leave are remembered by name, at least by the older generation. They tell of one final Friday prayer at the mosque, of tea brewed in clay pots one last time, of cousins shouting over who forgot to pack the mortar paddle. One woman, now in her 80s, called placing her favorite seashell on the doorstep before walking away. I wanted the house to know I wasn't mad, just tired. That kind of sentiment shows up often in the stories of departure. Not sadness, not loss, just acceptance. As though the town had been rented from the sea and the lease had quietly expired. But not everyone left completely. Some residents came back, once a week, once a year, whenever the tides allowed. They swept out their old homes, made tea in rusted kettles, and told their children stories that began with, "Back when this place had noise." Others never returned. The memory of goat-stamped courtyards and wind-whistling barge eels was enough. Why disturb the bones? And the bones did remain. Cracked coral walls, shell-laced windows, doorways still bearing faded handprints from generations past. The town never burned, never collapsed. It was simply abandoned with such gentleness that it barely noticed. Scientists and anthropologists are still puzzled by how complete yet bloodless the departure was. No signs of struggle, no barricades or battle scars, just homes left mostly intact, items still in cupboards, furniture rearranged for the last time, then frozen in place like a quiet shrug. This kind of clean break is rare in urban history. Cities tend to fall with drama, with sieges, floods, or financial ruin. Al Jazeera Al-Hamra, it faded like a tide, a sandcastle that wasn't stomped, just left to the wind. And the wind did what it always does. It moved in, rearranged, preserved what it liked, buried what it didn't. The town became quieter, then quieter still. The goats eventually wandered off. The cats ruled briefly, then ceded power to the dust. Tourists today, those few who wander off the highway, braving the sun and the occasional stern owl, walk through these ruins and often remark on how recent everything feels. Not ancient, not distant, just paused, as if the residents might come back any second, hauling baskets of oysters and asking why you're in their kitchen. The last homes to be abandoned show signs of modern transition. Electric sockets, faded linoleum tiles, even a plastic chair or two. They stand in subtle contrast to their older neighbors, who cling to their shell and coral integrity like dignified grandmothers refusing to wear polyester. One building near the edge of town has a message carved into the wall. Possibly a farewell. Possibly just an old graffiti artist with decent timing. It reads, "If the sea leaves, we must follow." That line is now quoted by everyone from Instagrammers to university lecturers, printed on postcards, whispered during walking tours, turned into a metaphor so often, it's surprising the wall hasn't asked for royalties. But maybe the line was never meant to be poetic. Maybe it was just factual. If your life, your buildings, your culture, if all of it comes from the sea, then the moment the tide stops feeding you, you pack your things, kiss the plaster, and go. Yet even in their absence, the people of Al Jazeera Al-Hamra remain. They return in stories, in the faint smell of shell lime after a rain, in the odd echo that bounces down the alley like a misfired memory, in the child's drawing scratched onto coral with a fishbone, still visible if the light hits just right. The town may be empty of people, but it's full of presence. And maybe that's the strangest part. Not that it was abandoned, but that it remembers being full. That the walls still expect footsteps. That the wells still think someone's coming back for water. That somewhere in a dusty room, a shell waits on a windowsill, not as a relic, but as a welcome. If you visit Al Jazeera Al Hamra today, you might be surprised by what greets you. Not the ghosts, though they're still whispering. Not the goats, those freeloaders moved on. But something more unexpected. Tour buses, Instagram influencers with wide-brimmed hats, students squinting through the desert glare, sketching coral archways. And yes, the occasional confused tourist muttering, "Where's the museum?" Because now, after all these quiet decades, the Shell City is being remembered. Not as a ghost town, but as a heritage site. A sand-swept snapshot of Gulf life before oil, before air conditioning, before concrete. Preservation efforts began modestly. A few historians, a couple of curious architects, local families returning to sweep out the ruins and repaint a wall or two. But then word spread. Articles were written, documentaries aired. Suddenly people realized this wasn't just a forgotten fishing village. It was one of the last surviving examples of a pre-oil Gulf settlement built almost entirely from organic materials. So the work began. Gently, carefully, not to modernize, but to stabilize. Coral walls were braced. Shell lime mortar was mixed again, though with less camel hair, one assumes. The mosque was reinforced. The old fort's jagged edges were patched, not erased, just steadied. Now, walk through the town and you'll find signs. Not spirits, but signage. Small metal plaques offering dates, diagrams, and just enough context to make you feel smarter without spoiling the magic. This was a Pearling family home. This bargeal is original. Please do not climb on the coral. You'll still see footprints on the coral. And then there are the photographers. This place is catnip for camera lenses. The textures, the light. The way the sun creeps through collapsed roofs, casting angular shadows across shell-laced walls. You'll spot wedding shoots happening where fish once dried. Fashion influencers posing against wind towers. Even the occasional drone buzzing over the alleyways like a confused, high-tech bee. But perhaps most charming are the school trips. Groups of children from Ras Al Khaimah and beyond, wandering through the ruins with clipboards and snacks. Teachers explain how the people here used to live, cook, sleep, and argue. The kids look skeptical. No phones, one asks, not even a fan? Another adds, fanning herself dramatically with a worksheet. And then someone finds a shell. A real one, embedded in a crumbling wall, still ridged, still faintly iridescent. They gasp. They crowd around it like it's a fossil, which in a way it is. That one shell becomes the highlight of the field trip. They take pictures, they name it, someone gives it a voice. "Hello, I'm Shelley. I lived here in 1892. I saw everything." It's silly and oddly moving, because for all the preservation and scholarship, the spirit of Al Jazeera Al Hamra lives in the feeling, in the way wind still moves through the bargeal towers, in the hum of silence that settles after the last bus pulls away, in the fact that some houses still smell faintly of lime and sea and something else, something like waiting. Scientists and heritage experts continue to debate how best to conserve the site. Should it be fully restored or left in its elegant decay? Should modern paths be laid, or should visitors continue to crunch through the sand, tripping occasionally on ancient doorstep stones? The answer so far seems to be a compromise. Maintain the town's character, stabilize where needed, and let the elements have their say. And the elements do have their say. Despite the best efforts of architects and caretakers, the desert is still very much in charge. Sand seeps in. Salt eats at the mortar. Wind sculpts the walls in slow, scratchy patterns. Some buildings survive a decade, others collapse overnight. You can almost hear the town sighing, "Nice try, humans, but I remember before you." And yet, for all its fragility, the town endures. Maybe not as a bustling port, but as something quieter, a reminder of a time before high-rises and glass malls, before traffic and tick-tocks, when life moved to the rhythm of tides and tea, and your roof was made of palm and prayer. Tourists leave the town sunburned and blinking, some inspired, some puzzled. A few deeply moved, and some come back, again and again, not just for the photos, but for the hush, for the sense that, even if nothing happens here, something is always listening. One visitor recently described Al Jazeera Al Hamra as a ghost town with manners. And that's about right. It doesn't scare you. It invites you in, makes you tea, tells you a story you weren't expecting, and then lets you wander off without asking for anything in return. No entry fee, no gift shop, just a coral wall under a blue sky, and the echo of footsteps that aren't quite yours. So here we are, back at the beginning, but quieter now. The sun is low, the shadows are long. The ruins of Al Jazeera Al Hamra cast their soft silhouettes across the sand like memories stretched thin and golden. You walk slowly through the last alley, your steps muffled by dust and time. The houses on either side lean slightly inward, like old friends whispering to one another. You pause. The air is still, and then, there it is, the sound. Not a voice, not quite. More like a breath, a hush moving through the wind towers, a soft sigh escaping through a cracked window frame. And for a moment you wonder, is the city exhaling or remembering? If a shell city crumbles, does it echo? That's the question this whole story leads to, not just in the literal can you hear it sense, but deeper. Can something made from perishable things, coral, shells, lime, stories, leave a mark that lingers long after the tides have turned? Walk past the old mosque. Its prayer niche still curves perfectly toward Mecca. There's no one inside, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels paused. Turn down the lane where the poet once lived. His walls are low now, slumped under decades of sun. But if you look closely, you'll see something tucked into the plaster near the door. A single shell, carefully placed. Not by a ghost, by someone who remembered. That's the echo, not noise but presence, not volume but persistence. You cross what used to be the marketplace. There are no stalls now, no spices, no pearly laughter. Just the faint outline of footsteps in the sand, like punctuation marks left behind in a story the wind hasn't quite finished reading. And finally, the edge of the town. There, the sea waits. Not the same sea, not really. It's shifted, receded, grown quieter. But it watches. You can feel it. The old partner, the co-architect. Still whispering, still waiting for someone to say thank you, or perhaps sorry, for all it gave and all it took. Scientists might call this feeling subjective, romantic, even silly. But stand there a little longer, and you'll hear it too. The creak of a shell beneath your foot. The snap of a wind tower beam catching a breeze, the way your breath slows, sinking to the silence. That's the city's heartbeat. It doesn't echo in the usual way. It folds into the wind, into the sand, into the story you now carry with you. You turn to leave. Behind you, nothing moves. And yet, you know, something watched you go. So now, as we gently return from the coral alleys and shell-strewn courtyards of Al Jazeera Al Hamra, let your thoughts settle like the desert dust we've stirred along the way. The town is quiet again. The wind has slipped back into its usual rhythm. No footsteps, no chatter. Just the soft memory of a place that lived with the sea and learned, graciously, how to let go. Feel your breath slow. Inhale like the tide rolling in. Exhale like the tide drifting out. Imagine the soft scrape of sandals on crushed shell paths. The whisper of a palm mat being shaken out before dawn. The faint tinkling of wind through a barge eel, barely more than a lullaby. Nothing loud, nothing urgent, just the world continuing gently. In the silence you may still hear that one seashell embedded in a wall, untouched for decades, whispering its tiny, salt-stained memories. Let it speak. Maybe it tells you about the barefoot scribe. Maybe it hums a lullaby from the market. Or maybe it simply says nothing at all and invites you to rest. There's no rush now, no tide to chase, no sun to flee. Just the slow, steady hush of a place where the sea once built a city, and the people knew when it was time to listen. So close your eyes, let the wind guide you out. And if you dream tonight of coral towers and shell-laced stories, well, maybe the city hasn't finished speaking after all.